The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Pendleton as Sarah Martinez walked nervously toward the main mess hall. She clutched her visitor's badge tightly, still getting used to the military base where her husband Miguel had been stationed for the past 6 months. Sarah had driven 4 hours from Los Angeles to surprise Miguel for their anniversary, but she wasn't prepared for how overwhelming the base would feel. Sarah was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile that had first caught Miguel's attention in college. She worked as an elementary school teacher and had never been around military life before Miguel enlisted. The sound of boots on concrete, the sharp commands echoing across the base, and the sight of Marines in their crisp uniforms made her feel like she was in a different world. She had planned to meet Miguel for lunch, but he was running late from a training exercise. The mess hall was busy with the lunch crowd, filled with Marines of all ranks grabbing quick meals between duties. Sarah found a corner table and sat quietly, checking her phone for any messages from Miguel. She tried to blend in, but her civilian clothes and nervous energy made her stand out among the uniformed personnel. At a nearby table sat Jake Morrison, a civilian contractor who had been working on the base for several months. Jake was a large man in his 40s with a short temper and a drinking problem that he tried to hide from his supervisors. He had a history of trouble with authority and had bounced between different military contracts over the years. His current job involved maintenance work on base vehicles, and he often felt looked down upon by the Marines he worked alongside. Jake had been having a particularly bad morning. His supervisor had written him up for showing up late again, and he had gotten into an argument with a Marine sergeant about proper vehicle inspection procedures. He was eating alone, nursing his anger and looking for someone to blame for his problems. Sarah accidentally knocked over her water glass while reaching for her phone. The plastic cup clattered to the floor and water splashed across the table. She quickly bent down to pick up the cup, apologizing quietly to herself. The small commotion caught Jake's attention, and he looked over with irritation. "Great, just what this place needs," Jake muttered under his breath, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Civilians who don't know how to act." Sarah looked up, confused by the hostile comment. She hadn't done anything to him, and the spilled water was clearly an accident. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Jake stood up from his table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several Marines glanced over, sensing tension in the air. "You people don't belong here," Jake said, his voice growing louder. "This is a military facility, not some family restaurant where you can make a mess." Sarah felt her face grow hot with embarrassment. She could feel other people staring now, and she wished Miguel would arrive soon. "I'm just waiting for my husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll clean up the water." "Your husband?" Jake laughed harshly. "Let me guess, some boot Marine who thinks he's hot stuff now? You probably don't even understand what real military service means." The mess hall was growing quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Marines at nearby tables stopped eating and turned to watch. They could see that Jake was picking on someone who clearly didn't want any trouble. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran Marine with 15 years of service, was sitting 2 tables away. He had been enjoying a rare, quiet lunch break when he noticed the situation developing. Rodriguez had seen Jake around the base before and knew about his reputation for causing problems. What concerned him more was seeing a young woman being intimidated by someone twice her size. Sarah tried to stand up to leave, hoping to diffuse the situation by removing herself from it. "I think I'll just wait outside," she said, gathering her purse. "Oh no, you don't get to just walk away after disrupting everyone's meal," Jake said, moving to block her path. His voice was getting angrier, and Sarah could see that his hands were shaking slightly. She realized that something was very wrong with this man, and fear began to creep into her chest. "Please, I don't want any trouble," Sarah repeated, taking a step back. She was trapped between Jake and the table with nowhere to go. "You should have thought about that before you came here," Jake said. Without warning, he reached out and shoved Sarah hard in the shoulder. She stumbled backward, her hip hitting the table as she fought to keep her balance. The mess hall fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork was set down. Even the kitchen staff stopped what they were doing and looked out through the serving window. But Jake wasn't finished. Something had snapped inside him, and all his anger and frustration were pouring out on this innocent woman. "That's what happens when you don't show respect," he said with a cruel laugh. Then, in front of dozens of Marines, Jake raised his hand and struck Sarah across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the silent mess hall like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped to the side and she raised her hand to her cheek in shock and pain. Tears immediately sprang to her eyes, not just from the physical impact, but from the humiliation of being attacked in front of so many strangers. Jake stepped back, a satisfied smile on his face. He seemed pleased with himself, as if he had just put someone in their place. He looked around the mess hall, expecting to see approval or at least indifference from the Marines. Instead, he saw something that made his smile fade quickly. Every single Marine in the mess hall was staring at him with expressions of cold fury. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't the silence of people trying to mind their own business. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something unforgivable. Then, as if responding to an unspoken command, something remarkable happened. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood up from his table, his chair pushing back with deliberate slowness. His eyes never left Jake's face, and his expression was carved from stone. A second later, Corporal Johnson at the next table stood up as well, then Private First Class Williams, then Sergeant Davis. One by one, every Marine in the mess hall rose to their feet. The sound of chairs scraping and boots hitting the floor filled the air. But no one said a word. Jake's smile disappeared completely as he found himself surrounded by a sea of standing Marines, all facing him with the same unmistakable message in their eyes. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The silence in the mess hall stretched on, thick and dangerous. Jake Morrison looked around at the wall of standing Marines surrounding him, and for the first time, real fear began to creep into his chest. These weren't just random military personnel. These were United States Marines, and he had just committed an unforgivable act in front of all of them. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez took a slow step forward, his movements controlled and deliberate. At 38 years old, he had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and had seen more combat than Jake could imagine. But right now, his anger wasn't about war or enemies overseas. It was about a helpless woman who had been struck by a coward. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of his rank. "Are you hurt?" He didn't take his eyes off Jake, but his question was directed to Sarah, who was still holding her cheek, where the red handprint was clearly visible. Sarah nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't badly injured, but the shock and humiliation were overwhelming. She had never been hit by anyone in her life, and certainly not by a stranger in front of so many people. Corporal Maria Santos, one of only 3 female Marines in the mess hall, stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Sarah's arm. "It's okay now," she said softly. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." Santos was known throughout her unit for her toughness and training, but her voice was gentle as she guided Sarah to a chair away from Jake. Jake tried to take a step backward, but found his way blocked by more Marines. Private Williams, barely 19 years old, but already showing the discipline and courage of his training, stood firm behind Jake. Williams was from a small town in Ohio where his mother had raised him to never hit a woman, no matter what. Seeing Jake strike Sarah had triggered something deep in his core values. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to sound casual, as if what had just happened was no big deal. "The lady just startled me and I reacted. It was just a reflex." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez took another step closer. He was now close enough that Jake could see the controlled fury in his eyes. "A reflex?" Rodriguez repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "You reflexively strike women who accidentally spill water?" The other Marines began to close in slightly, not threatening violence, but making it clear that Jake wasn't going anywhere. Sergeant Davis, a mountain of a man from Texas, cracked his knuckles unconsciously. He had 3 sisters back home, and the sight of Jake hitting Sarah had brought out every protective instinct he possessed. Lance Corporal Thompson, who had been quietly eating his lunch in the corner, stood up and walked over to Sarah. He pulled out his cell phone and held it up. "I got it all on video," he announced to the room. "The whole thing. Him blocking her way, shoving her, and then hitting her." Jake's face went pale. In today's world, he knew that video evidence could destroy his life. His job, his reputation, everything could be gone in an instant. "Now wait a minute," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "You can't just record people without permission." "Actually, we can," said Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, who had just walked into the mess hall after hearing about the commotion from the kitchen staff. Martinez was Sarah's husband, Miguel's platoon sergeant, though he didn't know about the family connection yet. He was a 20-year veteran who had worked his way up through the ranks and commanded respect from everyone on the base. Martinez surveyed the scene quickly, taking in the standing Marines, the frightened woman holding her cheek, and the civilian contractor who was clearly the center of attention. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" he asked. "This man struck a visitor to our base," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez reported crisply. "Without provocation, in front of multiple witnesses." Martinez's expression darkened. He walked over to Sarah, who was still being comforted by Corporal Santos. "Ma'am, I'm Gunnery Sergeant Martinez. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah shook her head, though she was still shaking from the encounter. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I just want to call my husband." "What's your husband's name, ma'am?" Martinez asked gently. "Miguel Martinez," Sarah replied. "He's in your unit, I think. We have the same last name, but we're not related to you." Martinez's eyes widened slightly. He knew Miguel well. The young Marine was one of his most promising junior Marines, always professional, always respectful. Miguel had mentioned his wife Sarah many times, always with obvious love and pride. To think that this woman, his Marine's wife, had been attacked on his base made Martinez's blood boil. "Rodriguez," Martinez said, his voice taking on the sharp edge of command. "Escort this man to the security office, now!" Jake realized that his situation had just gotten much worse. "Look, this is all blown out of proportion," he said desperately. "I work here. I'm a contractor. You can't just—" "Sir," Rodriguez interrupted, stepping close enough to Jake that the civilian could smell his aftershave. "You have 2 choices. You can walk to the security office under your own power, or you can be carried there, but you are going to that security office." Jake looked around the room one more time, hoping to find a friendly face or someone who might take his side. Instead, he saw dozens of Marines who looked like they were barely restraining themselves from taking more direct action. These men and women had sworn an oath to protect others, and they had just watched him attack someone who couldn't defend herself. Private Williams, the young Marine from Ohio, stepped forward. Despite being the youngest person in the room, his voice was steady and clear. "Sir, in basic training, they taught us that Marines protect those who can't protect themselves. That's who we are. That's what we do." The simple words hit Jake like a physical blow. He realized that he hadn't just hit a woman. He had violated everything these people stood for. In their eyes, he was no better than an enemy combatant. "Let's go," Rodriguez said, placing a firm hand on Jake's arm. It wasn't quite an arrest, but it was close. Jake allowed himself to be guided toward the exit, knowing that resistance would only make things worse. As they walked through the mess hall, every Marine they passed stood at attention. It wasn't a formal military courtesy. It was a show of respect for Sarah and a clear message to Jake that his actions were unacceptable to every person in uniform. Meanwhile, Gunnery Sergeant Martinez was making phone calls, first to base security, then to Jake's contracting company, and finally to Miguel Martinez, who was still in the field with his training unit. "Martinez," came Miguel's voice over the radio, slightly breathless from whatever exercise he was running. "Marine, you need to get to the main mess hall immediately," Martinez said. "Your wife is here, and there's been an incident." The radio crackled with static for a moment. "Is she hurt, Gunny?" Miguel's voice was tight with worry. "She's shaken up but not seriously injured. Just get here as fast as you can." Within minutes, Miguel was running across the base, still in his training gear, his heart pounding with fear and anger. When he burst through the mess hall doors, the first thing he saw was Sarah sitting with Corporal Santos, a red mark still visible on her cheek. "Sarah!" Miguel rushed to her side, gathering her into his arms. "Baby, what happened? Are you okay?" Through her tears, Sarah told him everything, about Jake's verbal harassment, about being shoved, and about the slap that had shocked the entire mess hall into action. Miguel listened with growing fury, his jaw clenched tight as he fought to control his emotions. "Where is he now?" Miguel asked Gunnery Sergeant Martinez. "Being processed by base security," Martinez replied. "And don't even think about going after him, Marine. Justice will be served, but it'll be served the right way." Miguel nodded, understanding the wisdom in his sergeant's words, but the fire in his eyes made it clear that Jake Morrison had made an enemy for life. 3 hours after the incident in the mess hall, Jake Morrison sat in a cold, windowless room at the base security office, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. Across from him sat Captain James Wilson, the base legal officer, and Master Sergeant Patricia Hayes, the senior investigator for incidents involving civilian contractors. Captain Wilson reviewed the file in front of him, which had grown thick remarkably quickly. "Mr. Morrison," he began, his voice professional but stern, "we have video evidence of the assault, written statements from 12 witnesses, and photographs of the victim's injuries. Do you understand the seriousness of your situation?" Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The bravado and anger that had driven him to strike Sarah had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Look, I know I made a mistake," he said, "but it's not like I seriously hurt her. It was just a slap." Master Sergeant Hayes, a 30-year veteran who had seen every type of misconduct imaginable, fixed Jake with a cold stare. "Just a slap?" she repeated. "Mr. Morrison, you committed assault and battery against the spouse of a United States Marine on a federal military installation in front of dozens of witnesses. There is no just about any of this." Captain Wilson pulled out a thick document and placed it on the table. "This is your contract with the base. Section 4.3 clearly states that any contractor who engages in criminal behavior, creates a hostile work environment, or brings discredit to the installation will be immediately terminated and banned from all military facilities." Jake's hands began to shake as he realized his job was gone. The contracting work had been his only stable employment in years, and without it, he had no way to pay his rent or support himself. "You can't fire me over one incident," he protested weakly. "Mr. Morrison," Captain Wilson continued, "your termination is the least of your concerns. We've contacted the civilian police and they will be filing criminal charges for assault. The victim has the right to press charges and given the circumstances, it's likely she will." Outside the security office, Sarah Martinez sat with her husband Miguel and Gunnery Sergeant Martinez in the Family Services office. The base chaplain, Lieutenant Commander Roberts, had joined them to provide support and counseling. Sarah's cheek was no longer swollen, but the emotional impact of the attack was still very real. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if those Marines hadn't been there," Sarah said quietly, holding Miguel's hand tightly. "He was so angry, so out of control. I've never seen anything like that before. Miguel squeezed her hand, still fighting his own anger at not being there to protect his wife. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, baby. If you had been there, you might have done something that could have hurt your career, Gunnery Sergeant Martinez interrupted gently. What happened today showed exactly why we have protocols and why we trust our fellow Marines to do the right thing. Lieutenant Commander Roberts nodded. Sarah, what you experienced today was traumatic, and it's natural to feel shaken. But I want you to know that you also witnessed something beautiful. You saw an entire room of Marines stand up for what's right without hesitation, without being ordered to do so. Meanwhile, word of the incident had spread throughout the base. In the barracks, Marines who hadn't been present were hearing the story from those who had witnessed it. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself telling the tale to his squad during their evening briefing. I want you all to understand what happened today, Rodriguez said to his Marines. This wasn't about rank or protocol or following orders. This was about fundamental human decency. When we saw someone helpless being attacked by someone stronger, we acted. Not because we had to, but because it was right. Private Williams, the young Marine from Ohio, raised his hand. Staff Sergeant, do you think we handled it correctly? I mean, we could have just jumped him. Rodriguez smiled slightly. Williams, anyone can throw a punch. What we did today was harder. We showed discipline. We showed unity. We showed that Marine Corps values aren't just words on a poster, they're how we live our lives. That man learned today that actions have consequences, and he learned it in a way he'll never forget. Back at the security office, Jake was learning about those consequences in detail. Detective Sarah Kim from the local sheriff's department had arrived to take over the criminal investigation. As a civilian employee who had committed a crime on federal property, Jake would face charges in both civilian and federal court. Mr. Morrison, Detective Kim began, you're being charged with assault and battery, disturbing the peace, and creating a public disturbance. Because this occurred on a military base, federal charges may also be filed. Do you understand these charges? Jake nodded miserably. He was beginning to realize that his moment of anger was going to cost him everything. His job was gone, his security clearance would be revoked, and he would likely face jail time. Worse still, the video of the incident was already making its way around social media. Thanks to Marines who had been present. Captain Wilson placed another document on the table. This is a restraining order issued by the base commander. You are banned from entering any military installation for a period of 5 years. If you violate this order, you will be arrested on sight. As evening fell over Camp Pendleton, Sarah and Miguel were finally heading home. The base chaplain had arranged for them to stay in guest quarters for the night, as Sarah was still too shaken to make the long drive back to Los Angeles. Before they left the main administrative building, they were approached by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and several of the Marines who had been present during the incident. Sarah was surprised to see these tough, disciplined soldiers looking almost shy as they approached. Ma'am, Rodriguez said formally, we just wanted to check on you and make sure you're doing all right. Sarah looked at these men and women who had stood up for her without even knowing her name. I don't know how to thank you, she said, tears forming in her eyes again. You didn't know me. You had no reason to get involved, but you did anyway. Corporal Santos stepped forward. Ma'am, with respect, we had every reason to get involved. You're part of our Marine family now. You're Miguel's wife, which makes you our responsibility too. Private Williams added, my mom always taught me that you judge a person's character by how they treat people who can't defend themselves. What that man did was wrong, and we couldn't just stand by and watch. Miguel shook hands with each of the Marines, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for protecting my wife when I couldn't be there. I'll never forget this. 6 months later, Jake Morrison was sitting in a county jail cell, serving a 6-month sentence for assault. He had lost his job, his apartment, and his reputation. The video of him striking Sarah had been viewed millions of times online, and he had become a symbol of cowardly behavior that even strangers on the street recognized and condemned. More importantly, he had learned that actions truly do have consequences. In a moment of anger, he had chosen to hurt someone weaker than himself, and that choice had destroyed his life. He spent his days in jail thinking about that moment, wishing he could take it back, but knowing that some choices can never be undone. Meanwhile, Sarah had recovered from the trauma with the help of counseling and the support of her husband and his Marine family. She still visited Miguel at the base regularly, but now she walked through the mess hall with confidence, knowing that she was surrounded by people who would protect her. The incident became part of the base's unofficial history, a story that was told to new Marines as an example of what it meant to live by the core values. It wasn't about the violence or the punishment, it was about the moment when every Marine in that room chose to stand up without being ordered, because it was the right thing to do. Years later, Private Williams, now a sergeant himself, would tell the story to his own Marines. "That day taught me that being a Marine isn't just about what you do in combat," he would say. "It's about who you are when you think nobody's watching, and who you become when someone needs your help." The story of that day in the mess hall became a reminder that true strength isn't about overpowering the weak. It's about protecting them. And sometimes the most powerful response to violence isn't more violence, but the simple act of good people standing up and saying, "Not here, not on our watch, not ever." In the end, Jake Morrison learned the hardest lesson of his life, that in a world full of Marines, there's no place to hide from the consequences of cowardice. And Sarah Martinez learned something equally important, that even in moments of helplessness, she was never truly alone.